One ordinary morning, a retired professor sat at his kitchen table, struggling with a crossword puzzle, never guessing that a wild bobcat kitten was about to stroll through his backyard and rewrite the story of his life. What happened next would baffle the neighbors, change two old men forever, and prove that sometimes the wildest visitors bring the greatest joy. Would you have let a bobcat into your home? Tell us in the comments below. If this story touches your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with a friend who loves animals. There's always room for a little more wildness in our lives. Arthur stared at the jumble of black and white squares, his pencil tapping a slow rhythm on the kitchen table. Morning sun cut across the checkered floor, turning the air gold, but he barely noticed. His mind was stuck on one clue near the corner. A form of chaos that is adorable, unpredictable. He muttered it under his breath, rereading the clue for the 5th time, chewing his lower lip the way he did when a book left him puzzled. It was a rare morning where the world outside felt as still as the living room, except for the sharp, insistent scratching sound at the edge of his consciousness. Arthur tried to ignore it, but the scratching grew louder. He finally looked up, and in that ordinary second, the whole quiet morning tipped sideways. There, moving across the dew-damp yard, was Leo, his loyal old house cat. Leo's orange tabby fur caught the morning light, tail held straight up, paws neat and confident. But what froze Arthur's breath mid-chest wasn't Leo. It was the odd little creature striding right beside him. A wild kitten, but not just any stray. Tufted ears, spotted gold fur, tail no longer than a child's thumb. For a blink, Arthur thought his glasses were dirty. He blinked twice. The creature was still there, not slinking or hiding, but marching with Leo like they'd known each other forever. Arthur's heart thudded. "Ben!" he called, voice shaky with a cocktail of disbelief and worry. From the other room, Ben shuffled in, plaid pajama pants, wild silver hair, the half-smirk he wore every morning before coffee. "You lose your crossword, old man?" "Look out there," Arthur whispered. I think Leo brought home a wild animal." Ben leaned in, peered through the window. His grin spread. "That's not a house cat. That's a bobcat kitten." His voice carried a blend of awe and mischief, as if this sort of thing happened every week. Arthur sputtered, torn between panic and fascination. "Is it dangerous?" Ben shrugged. "She looks more curious than anything." "Maybe the answer to your crossword just walked into the yard." Outside, Leo paused, glancing back as if checking that his human audience was paying attention. The bobcat kitten mirrored him, sitting tall on the frost-kissed grass. For a moment, the two felines shared an easy silence, eyes reflecting the pale sky. Arthur pressed his palm flat to the window, torn between wanting to run outside and wanting to bolt the door. Ben's hand landed heavy on Arthur's shoulder. "Relax. The only chaos happening here is in your crossword." Arthur almost laughed. Almost. He kept watching as Leo stretched lazily, then flicked his tail, leading the little wild visitor closer to the porch. The bobcat's eyes were wide and bright, like molten amber, curiosity pulsing in every twitch of her ears. Arthur's mind spiraled. Should they call animal control? Should they just watch? But Ben, ever the pragmatist, just shook his head. Maybe this is one of those days when you stop trying to solve every puzzle and just see what happens next. Arthur looked down at his crossword, the stubborn clue waiting. Outside, the bobcat kitten and Leo sat side by side, their silhouettes stitched together by early light. Something about that picture, a tame old cat and a wild child of the forest, at peace, felt like its own kind of answer. He didn't know it yet, but his world had just cracked open, and the word for that, he'd learn, was about more than crosswords. Leo, always the lord of his own domain, never bothered with formalities. He nudged the screen door with his shoulder, and, almost as if rehearsed, the door gave way just enough for him to slip inside. Arthur, still glued to the window, didn't breathe until the wild kitten hesitated at the threshold. For a second, all was still. Then, with a boldness only youth and wild blood could give, the bobcat kitten trotted right in after Leo. The click of her claws on the linoleum was sharp, but the little bobcat barely flinched. Her nose worked the air, whiskers trembling with the promise of discovery. She moved with the confidence of someone who'd been here before, yet every step screamed mischief. Ben leaned against the fridge, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold like the world's oddest sitcom. "Well, aren't we running a zoo now?" Leo headed straight for his food dish, tail flicking as if this was an ordinary Tuesday. The bobcat stopped, planted herself squarely beside him, and stared at the bowl with a look that made it clear. She was here for breakfast, too. Arthur's anxiety warred with wonder. The room filled with sunlight and tension, the smell of coffee, and the low rumble of Leo's purr as he watched his new companion. The kitten didn't make a sound. She just kept looking, at the bowl, at Leo, at Arthur and Ben. It was both a challenge and an invitation. Ben, ever the peacemaker, reached for the pantry. He fished out an old can of tuna, popped the lid, and set a dish down on the kitchen floor, close but not too close to Leo's usual spot. The bobcat's head snapped toward the scent. For one frozen heartbeat, Arthur braced himself for a hiss or a swipe, but Leo just licked his paw, unimpressed. With a swift, almost comical bounce, the kitten was on the dish, eating with the single-minded focus of a creature who never knew where the next meal might come from. Flakes of tuna scattered. Tiny claws drummed a staccato rhythm on the tile. Ben couldn't help it. He laughed, a warm, rolling sound that melted Arthur's nerves. "Guess she's staying for breakfast." Something about her wild confidence was infectious. Even Arthur found himself smiling, the absurdity of it all settling into a kind of joy. He eased into his usual chair, careful not to move too quickly. The kitten shot him a look, sharp, bright, not the least bit afraid. She finished the tuna, sat up, and licked her nose with delicate precision. Leo, not to be outdone, nudged her with his shoulder, as if to say, "You've passed the test." Ben's laughter bubbled up again. "You know, Art, I've seen stranger things, but not many." Arthur glanced at the crossword on the table, that stubborn clue still mocking him. Outside, the world spun on, unchanged, but inside, their quiet kitchen had been transformed by the small, wild storm that now curled up by Leo's side, eyes half closed, tail flicking in the sunlight. For the first time all morning, Arthur felt a lightness he hadn't known he was missing. He didn't know what would come next, but he was ready to find out. Morning slipped into afternoon, and with it, a new energy took hold of the house, a wild, unpredictable current that no amount of retirement routine could contain. The Bobcat Kitten, who still had no name but already 100 nicknames, became the beating heart of chaos. It started with the red laser pointer. Arthur had kept it on his desk for years, more for idle doodling than feline entertainment. But the second that little red dot zipped across the floor, The kitten exploded into action, paws flying, back legs skidding, fur bristling with excitement. Leo watched from the window ledge, a resigned elder statesman, while Ben grinned and Arthur, caught between laughter and awe, surrendered to the spectacle. She missed the dot more often than she caught it. She crashed into chair legs, bounced off the rug, and at one point managed to slide directly into Arthur's shoes, sending them skittering across the floor. Not to be outdone, Leo joined the chase, though with half-hearted dignity, occasionally batting the kitten's tail for good measure. The two of them tangled and tumbled, their movements a blur of gold and orange on the faded kitchen tiles. It didn't stop there. Ben tried to water the spider plant by the window, but the kitten had other plans. She leapt after the stream, paws swatting at the droplets, soaking both herself and Ben in the process. Water splattered the counter. The plant tipped sideways. Ben only shook his head, water dripping from his sleeves, and muttered, "Maybe we should have just gotten a goldfish." Later, Arthur settled in his armchair for a quiet read, the crossword puzzle abandoned but not forgotten. He barely got through a single paragraph before feeling a soft weight land in his lap, a familiar routine, except this time, it was the wild kitten, not Leo, who claimed the prime spot. Leo glared from the carpet, tail thumping, before reluctantly curling up nearby. The kitten kneaded Arthur's legs, purring a rough, wild purr that vibrated all the way to his heart. Sometimes, in those small, ordinary moments, Arthur would glance back at the crossword lying on his table. The clue still sat there, untouched. A form of chaos that is adorable, unpredictable. He sighed, letting the pencil roll between his fingers. Each time he tried to focus, some new mischief would erupt. A toppled mug, a runaway feather, a burst of laughter from Ben as the kitten made off with a sock. Day by day, the rhythms of the house shifted. The once predictable routine was now shaped by the unpredictable. Paws on counters, streaks of fur dashing down the hallway, the echo of wild joy in every room. Ben kept a tally on the fridge of things broken this week. The list grew longer, but so did their smiles. In the quiet moments, when the house finally settled and the kitten curled in a sunbeam, Arthur would catch himself grinning. He realized that he didn't mind the chaos. Not really. There was something about it. A spark he hadn't felt in years, like the first spring breeze after a long winter. Outside, evening shadows crept up the porch. Inside, laughter lingered in the air, mingling with the wild energy of their tiny guest. And somewhere in the back of Arthur's mind, the answer to his crossword clue waited, patient as ever, just out of reach. By the end of the week, Arthur had given up trying to keep order. The wild kitten, whose name still eluded them, had a new hobby, and it had nothing to do with chasing lasers or spilling water. It began one chilly morning, as Arthur slid his feet into his house slippers and felt something round and rough jammed against his toes. He jolted, bracing for a mouse. But when he tipped the slipper over, a small pine cone tumbled out onto the floor. Next to it, a bright red leaf, pressed flat, as if carefully chosen. Arthur stared, bemused. Ben chuckled over his coffee. At least it's not a snake. Call it progress. The kitten, meanwhile, watched from the threshold, eyes wide and unblinking, tail swishing in silent pride. When Arthur knelt to examine the offering, the kitten trotted over, rubbing her head against his leg with a quiet rumble of a purr. For the first time, Arthur caught the faintest scent of cedar and sun-warmed grass in her fur. It didn't stop there. Each day brought a new surprise. A smooth pebble, perfectly round, balanced on the heel of his shoe. A tuft of moss, soft and green, left at the foot of his armchair. Once a crumpled feather still shimmering with the memory of flight. At first, Arthur grumbled, good-natured, but a little flustered by the inconvenience. But Ben, always ready to see the humor, lined up the treasures along the windowsill like a museum display. "She's got a better eye for decoration than you ever did," he teased. The kitten's collection grew, and so did her confidence. She'd parade her finds through the kitchen, head held high, tail flicking with pride. Leo, unimpressed, pretended not to notice, but sometimes he'd nudge a pebble into the hallway just to watch her chase it down again. Arthur began to understand. These weren't random bits of forest. They were tokens, not the kind brought by a hunter, but the offerings of a creature learning what it meant to belong. The realization struck quietly, the way sunlight creeps into a room at dawn. She wasn't giving them prey. She was sharing her world. One pine cone, one pebble, one scrap of wildness at a time. One evening, as Arthur slipped his feet into his shoes for the 1,000th time, he felt a weight that was more comfort than inconvenience. He smiled, remembering childhood days spent hunting for treasures in the woods behind his grandparents' house. The kitten hopped onto his lap, settling into a soft circle, her purr deep and steady. Arthur scratched behind her tufted ears and whispered, "You're home now, aren't you?" She blinked, slow and deliberate, as if she'd been waiting for him to notice all along. The house felt different, fuller. The tiny tokens piled up, and so did Arthur's sense of connection, not just to the kitten, but to the old rhythms of the land, the things he'd nearly forgotten to cherish. Ben kept adding to the museum on the windowsill, cracking jokes about bobcat art for visiting friends. But Arthur knew better. Each pine cone, each feather, was a silent promise. You're part of my world, and I'm part of yours. That night, with the kitten curled against his feet, Arthur found himself wondering if sometimes the greatest treasures were the smallest, simplest things left right at your doorstep. Wordless mornings had become Arthur's favorite. He'd sip his coffee, watching Leo and the Bobcat Kitten share the porch like mismatched royalty. Ben usually appeared a little later, tousled hair and an old sweater, arms folded as he surveyed their wild kingdom. But secrets, like kittens, don't stay small for long. It was the mailman who first broke their bubble of quiet. He came whistling up the drive, boots crunching gravel, arms heavy with bills and circulars. Arthur opened the door, expecting the usual nod, but this time the mailman stopped short, eyebrows shooting up. "Is that—" He pointed past Arthur's shoulder. Arthur followed his gaze. There, in full view, sat the Bobcat Kitten on the porch railing, tail hanging off the side, golden eyes cool and unbothered. Leo sprawled beside her, completely at ease. Ben leaned against the doorframe, grinning. "Meet Willow," he said on impulse, the name slipping out before he realized it. The mailman shook his head, half laughing, half in awe. "Never seen anyone keep a bobcat as a house pet before. You guys running a nature reserve now?" Arthur blushed, unsure how to answer, but the mailman's smile softened the moment. "Don't worry. I've seen odder things on my route." He gave Willow a little wave and continued up the drive, shaking his head as he went. After that, things changed. The story spread, quietly, at first. The baker down the road dropped off a loaf and caught a glimpse of Willow lounging in the kitchen window. Neighbors paused longer at the fence, eyes wide, looking for a flash of spotted fur. Most folks just laughed, shaking their heads in disbelief. A few whispered concerns about wild animals and safety, but nothing serious. Ben handled the skeptics with his usual wit. "She's better behaved than Arthur," he'd joke, patting Willow's head as if to prove his point. Willow didn't seem bothered by the attention. If anything, she basked in it, sitting upright on the porch to watch passing cars, her ears swiveling like little radar dishes. The mailman, now in on the secret, made it a habit to greet the two rascals every morning. Sometimes he'd toss a treat or two, laughing as Willow caught them mid-air. Arthur felt the world tilt, just a bit, in these moments. The house felt more open, connected, no longer just a safe retreat from the noise, but a place where wonder showed up unannounced and took a seat at the table. Of course, there were hiccups. Once, Willow padded out to the edge of the yard while a group of school kids walked by. The children froze, mouths open, books clutched to their chests. Willow blinked once, twice, then trotted back to the porch, unimpressed by the stares. The kids burst into laughter and applause, and for days afterward, drawings of a spotted cat queen started showing up in the neighborhood mailbox. Arthur couldn't help but smile. Willow, with her wild confidence, was no longer just their secret. She was becoming a part of the town's story, weaving herself into the patchwork of daily life. He sometimes worried about what might come, rules, complaints, or the threat of someone taking her away. But every time Willow curled up at his feet, purring like a rough engine, those fears melted away. Some guests, Arthur realized, are meant to stay, others simply to be shared. And Willow, wild as she was, seemed to know the difference. Seasons changed quietly in Arthur's world, marked by the shifting angle of sunlight across the porch and the golden leaves collecting in the gutters. Willow grew with the months, trading her clumsy kitten legs for the sinewy, flowing grace of the wild. Her coat shimmered, no longer dull with youth, but burnished with streaks of gold and honey, flecked with the dappled browns of the woods she came from. Arthur watched her sometimes, awestruck, as she moved through the yard at dawn. She was both familiar and untamed, slipping between flower beds with a confidence that belonged to queens and shadows. Ben called her Princess, half in jest, but the name fit. Even Leo, old king of the house, seemed content to cede his throne to her. Despite her growing beauty, Willow's habits hadn't changed much. She still prowled the kitchen counters when she thought no one was watching, sprawled on Arthur's crossword puzzles, and batted pens across the table with a glint in her eye. Arthur found himself giving up on a neat desk. He'd catch her lying right on top of his half-finished puzzle, paws stretched luxuriously, as if daring him to move her. "Willow, you're incorrigible," he'd mutter, half annoyed, half amused. She'd flick her tail in response, eyes sparkling with mischief, as if mocking his frustration. Some afternoons, she'd leap onto Ben's chair, balancing on the armrest, surveying the room like it was her woodland kingdom. Ben pretended to grumble, but Arthur often caught him slipping her little treats or scratching the soft spot behind her ears. The house, once so silent, was now alive with the rhythm of her presence. There was joy in the unpredictability, shadows darting under the table, sudden bursts of wild energy in the hallway, a golden blur vanishing into the tall grass. Willow brought the forest indoors, turning every corner into a potential adventure. Arthur grew used to the new pace of things. He didn't try to keep order anymore. When Willow curled up on the morning newspaper or stretched across his crossword, he simply smiled and waited. The crossword clue that had stumped him for weeks. A form of chaos that is adorable, unpredictable. still lay unfinished on the table, but it didn't bother him now. He'd started to think maybe the answer was meant to remain a mystery, or maybe, he thought, he'd been living with the answer all along. Sometimes, as dusk settled outside and Willow prowled the window ledge, Arthur felt a sharp pang of gratitude. He realized how much had changed, not just in his house but in his own heart. The ache of years spent alone had faded, replaced by something wilder and softer. It was as if Willow had opened a window to a part of himself he'd sealed away. Ben called it magic. Arthur just called it Willow. On those quiet nights, with the lamp glowing and Willow sprawled across his papers, Arthur finally stopped fighting the chaos. He leaned back, let her purr rumble through the room, and knew in a way that words couldn't quite capture that some puzzles aren't meant to be solved. Some are meant to be lived. Spring crept in, quiet but relentless, painting the yard with wild violets and dapples of sunlight. The days grew longer, warmer. Willow, sleek, confident, no trace of kitten clumsiness left, seemed charged by the shifting winds. She chased bees in the garden, stalked the shadows beneath the lilac bush, and lounged for hours in a patch of sunlight, tail twitching with secret dreams. Then, one evening, as Arthur swept the porch, Ben's voice rang from the kitchen window. "Art, come look at this." Arthur wiped his hands and stepped outside. Ben pointed to the edge of the woods. There, at the place where the grass melted into tall pines, a shape moved, larger than Willow, muscled, head held high. A full-grown bobcat, broad-shouldered, with scars tracing one cheek and eyes the color of mountain whiskey. Willow froze mid-prowl, nose lifted, every muscle taut as a drawn bow. The world held its breath. Leo, old and wise, watched from his spot on the railing, tail curling tighter. Ben nudged Arthur, voice low but teasing. "Looks like your girl's got a boyfriend." Arthur couldn't help a nervous laugh. He tried to analyze, to understand. Was this a threat? Would Willow run? Was it safe? But all his professor's logic shrank under the raw, wild magic of the scene before him. The two bobcats locked eyes. For a moment, Willow didn't move. Then, slow as dusk falling, she walked toward the tree line, each step cautious but sure. The male bobcat waited, unblinking, tail flicking. He seemed both patient and untouchable, a shadow at the edge of another world. Arthur's heart twisted, a bittersweet ache growing sharp in his chest. He realized in that instant that he couldn't protect Willow from the call inside her bones. He saw something in her. Pride, hunger, a longing that didn't belong to any living room or crossword puzzle. Still, she hesitated. Halfway to the trees, Willow turned, looking back at the porch, at Arthur and Ben, at Leo with his gentle amber eyes. The evening air shimmered with possibility and loss. The male bobcat gave a soft, rasping trill, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the grass and into Arthur's bones. Willow answered, a note of wildness that made Arthur's skin prickle. The world felt both enormous and heartbreakingly small. Ben, perhaps sensing the weight of the moment, clapped Arthur on the back. "Let her go, old man. She's not lost. She's just living her story." For a while, nothing happened. Then Willow turned, trotted back to the porch, brushing her flank against Arthur's leg, her purr deep and rumbling. She climbed onto the railing, watching the male in the shadows. Arthur stroked her head, feeling the wildness thrumming beneath her skin. Night fell, and the woods swallowed the stranger. Willow stayed close that evening, dozing by the window, eyes drifting to the darkness outside. Arthur sat beside her, hand resting gently on her back, heart filled with pride and worry in equal measure. He understood then that love, real love, wasn't about keeping someone close, but letting them find where they truly belonged. And as the first stars appeared, Willow lifted her head, eyes bright with secrets, and Arthur whispered, "You'll always have a place here, wild girl, no matter where you roam." The next mornings came heavy with anticipation. Arthur found himself waking earlier, listening for the quiet thump of paws on the porch. Willow was always there, sometimes curled by the steps, sometimes perched on the rail, eyes fixed on the woods as if listening for a voice only she could hear. She was different now, softer, but stronger too. Her movements were measured, no longer driven by restless kitten curiosity, but by something deeper. She would brush past Arthur's legs with a gentle headbutt, circle Ben's feet with a low purr, and nuzzle Leo in the patch of sunlight where he liked to sleep. There was no drama, just a quiet sense of something winding down, of days counted not by the calendar, but by the way the shadows moved through the rooms. Ben noticed it first. "She's making her rounds," he said one afternoon, watching Willow rub her face against the edge of the kitchen table, "like she's saying goodbye to every corner." Arthur tried to smile, but a lump formed in his throat. He found Willow by his reading chair that evening, her golden eyes watching him with a warmth that felt like gratitude. He reached down, his fingers trembling just a little, and she pressed her head into his palm. For a moment, time slowed, a silent conversation neither of them would ever forget. That night, as Ben refilled the water dish, Willow followed, her steps unhurried. She leaned into his hand, licked his knuckles with a quick, rough tongue. Ben laughed, a sound half joy, half sorrow. "Take care out there, princess," he murmured, voice catching at the edges. Leo, dignified as ever, allowed Willow to nuzzle against his side. The old tabby purred, a deep rolling sound that filled the kitchen. For once there was no rivalry, no scramble for the best spot, just quiet acceptance and the soft, gentle bond that had grown between them. The house, usually buzzing with Willow's mischief, settled into a hush that evening. Arthur and Ben sat by the window, watching their wild friend move from room to room, pausing in every familiar place. She stopped at the front door, glancing back, as if memorizing every line and shadow. The porch light caught in her fur, turning her into a living ember, glowing and fading all at once. There were no words, just small gestures, a soft head pressed into a palm, a tail brushing over a slipper, the long, steady look of someone who knows the way home but must leave it behind. Arthur stood by the door, hand on the knob, heart full and aching. Willow lingered a moment longer, then stepped into the night, pausing at the top of the steps. She looked back, her gaze meeting Arthur's through the glass. In her eyes was a message: trust, love, and a promise that some bonds don't break with distance. As she slipped into the darkness, the house seemed to breathe out. A sigh. Part sorrow, part relief, but mostly gratitude. For a while Arthur and Ben sat in silence, the hush between them rich with memory. Leo curled at their feet, his purr a low, steady heartbeat in the empty room. The wildness hadn't left them. It just lived elsewhere now, carried in every memory, every pine cone and pebble left behind. Arthur closed his eyes, whispering his own silent goodbye to the wild, untamable spirit who had changed their lives forever. The morning after Willow's quiet farewell, the world outside felt emptier, every sound sharper. Arthur stood by the kitchen window, coffee cooling in his hands, eyes fixed on the tree line where wild things belonged. For a long while, nothing stirred but the wind through last year's leaves. Then, just as the sun broke free of the clouds, movement flashed in the golden grass. Willow appeared at the edge of the yard, fur lit by dawn, her walk graceful and sure. This time she wasn't alone. The male bobcat, the one with the scar, patient and proud, waited nearby, watching her with calm certainty. Ben came to stand beside Arthur, both men quiet, caught between wanting to call out and knowing they shouldn't. The porch was strangely still without the patter of Willow's paws. Even Leo sat up, tail curled tightly, eyes following every move outside. Willow didn't hesitate. She bounded toward the waiting bobcat, her stride smooth, tail high. At first, she paused halfway across the clearing, glancing back toward the porch. Arthur pressed a hand to the window, heart thumping with a wild, complicated joy. For just a moment, their eyes met. His world, her world, woven together by everything unspoken between them. Then Willow chirped softly, a note of recognition, and the male bobcat answered with a deep, rolling purr. In a blink, the two cats leapt into a playful chase, their bodies weaving in and out of sunlight, wild energy spilling into every corner of the yard. They tumbled, wrestled, disappeared into the brush, only to reappear moments later, golden fur flashing like a promise. Arthur and Ben stood on the porch, shoulders touching, saying nothing. There was no sadness, at least not the kind that begged for tears. What filled them was something else, a pride that stung a little, a sense of wonder at what it meant to give something back to the world. Ben wiped his eyes, smiling. "That's our girl," he said softly, and Arthur nodded, too full for words. The play in the field slowed. Willow and her companion stood at the edge of the woods, side by side, tails curled, gazes fixed on the tangle of green and shadow that waited for them. Willow hesitated once more, her silhouette sharp against the rising sun. Arthur could almost imagine her saying thank you, or perhaps just goodbye in the only language that mattered. With a final look, Willow melted into the trees, her golden shape swallowed by the wild. The forest accepted her back without ceremony, but something of her lingered in the air. The memory of paws on the porch, purrs in the quiet house, the wild hope she'd brought to their days. Leo let out a low meow, as if marking the moment. Arthur reached down, scratched the old tabby behind the ears. "She's home," he whispered. The emptiness that followed wasn't loss but a gentle ache, the kind that comes from loving something wild and letting it go. On the porch, Arthur and Ben stood a long while longer, watching the wind ripple through the grass where Willow had played, their hearts a little heavier, but also lighter, as if they too had been set free. The house was quieter in the days that followed. Mornings returned to their slow, familiar rhythm. Coffee brewing, Leo stretching by the heater, Ben humming off key as he shuffled through the newspaper. Yet in every room, traces of Willow remained. A pine cone beneath the radiator, a tuft of moss in an old slipper, a red leaf pressed flat beneath Arthur's reading lamp. Arthur found himself wandering the house, lingering in doorways, his thoughts looping through memories. The gentle headbutts, the wild leaps, the fierce golden eyes that had once studied him from across the kitchen. Sometimes he missed the chaos, the sudden dash of paws across the counter, the playful tussles between Willow and Leo, Ben's laughter rolling through the hall. The world seemed softer now, as if waiting for something he couldn't name. One afternoon, the sky heavy with spring rain, Arthur sat at his desk, the old crossword puzzle still open where he'd left it weeks before. The clue stared up at him. A form of chaos that is adorable, unpredictable. He turned the pencil between his fingers, feeling the weight of it. The answer had been there all along, he realized. With a quiet smile, Arthur filled in the squares. WILLOW, each letter a memory, each box a small, perfect tribute to the wildness that had changed his world. As he finished, a sense of peace settled over him, a gentle, humming warmth that filled the silent corners of the house. He looked up to find Ben watching from the doorway, a mug in hand, eyebrows raised in mock surprise. "You finally cracked it, huh?" Ben asked, nodding at the crossword. Arthur chuckled. "Took a wild cat to teach me a thing or two." He reached down, scratched Leo behind the ears, the old tabby purring in steady agreement. That evening, as dusk crept in, Arthur stepped out onto the porch. The world felt different, larger somehow. The yard, once just grass and fence, now seemed alive with unseen stories, every rustle of wind carrying the memory of Willow's presence. Sometimes, when the light was right, Arthur imagined he could see her golden silhouette at the edge of the woods, watching, not as a pet, but as a friend, untamed and free. Neighbors still asked about her, and the mailman never failed to greet the wild one, just in case she was near. Ben kept Willow's treasures lined up on the windowsill, a quiet museum of wild gifts and shared days. Arthur realized then that happiness wasn't found in keeping life neat and orderly. It was found in letting chaos in, trusting the unpredictable, welcoming the wild. The crossword hadn't really been about words at all. It was about opening his door and his heart to the possibility of joy in its strangest, most unexpected form. As night settled and the last light faded, Arthur whispered a thank you to Willow, to the wildness, to every twist of fate that had brought her to their door. He knew, deep down, that the greatest answers come not when you solve the puzzle, but when you let the story change you.